I think that most business problems are fundamentally causal, and kind of traditional predictive ML approaches, like taking straight off the shelf, often don't give you the right answer. And so there's a nice example of this, a paper by Eva Escarza in the context of cell phone carrier and also like an interest organization, it's like subscription based. And then she's trying to basically handle customer churn when customers like leave your marketplace or your platform. And there, the traditional machine learning approach is right to say, okay, let's predict who's likely to leave our platform, and we'll intervene by, let's say, giving them some cash or some discount on their current plan in order to get them to stay. And what she found that kind of the people that have the high probability of leaving, this is estimated by these models, are not the people, or they have much more limited overlap with the people for whom, if you were to intervene and give them some incentives to stay, they would respond to that.
Dimitriy, welcome to my podcast. Super excited to have you. Do you want to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. On my favorite topic of conversation, but I'm going to give you the executive summary. I'm Dimitriy Masterov. I live in sunny Oakland, California, and I am a fractional chief economist. And that's basically pretentious Bay Area way of saying that I have a handful of part-time startup jobs. I try to embed myself in early stage marketplaces, ones that don't quite have the need for a full-time economist, and I help them grow to a point where they would want a full-time version of me. And then I ideally help them find that person. And I kind of help them with monetization, acquisition of users, expansion strategies, kind of pricing, and also kind of various kinds of measurements that they're interested in. So it's kind of a mix of data work and model-driven strategy. And outside the office, I love camping in the redwoods. I like paddling my kayak around and, telling people at parties that I was into data before it was big.
Yeah. So how did you get into all of this? Because that sounds like a very, fun job description. And many people are probably like, what do I study in college to do that?
That's a complicated story. Let's see. Well, if I go all the way back to the beginning, I wanted to be a farmer growing up. And then I went to college to a school called Deep Springs that had a cattle ranch and a farm. And then I took my first economics class, and it completely derailed my, dreams of animal husbandry. And I just completely fell head over heels in love. And so after Deep Springs, I went to University of Chicago and I studied math and economics. And I started working for Jim Heckman, who's a econometrician and Nobel laureate. And I did work for him as a student, and then kind of 2 years as it wasn't called a pre-doc back then, but that's effectively what it was. And so we did a lot of work on the economics of early childhood education. And that's kind of what I spent years doing. And then I went to Michigan to do a PhD in economics. It took about 3 years to sort of admit that I took a wrong turn in my life. And so at that time, it was in the middle of the Great Recession, and all the finance jobs that I think someone with my toolkit would do were completely gone. And so I sort of spent 2 years doing weird, odd things, eventually landed a job at Domino's Pizza, and I helped them build a site selection algorithm to figure out where do you put pizzerias, kind of given where the competitors are and where your customers live or are, walking about. And so this kind of spatial demand model allowed them to increase the US store count by almost 40% in the 10 years since, with the descendants of this approach. I think it's probably my biggest visible, dent in the universe. And this job also kind of showed me that the tools that I picked up in grad school were actually useful in the real world and could really kind of be a career outside of kind of the finance world. So from there, I went west and I spent 5 years at eBay Research in the research labs in the group that Steve Tadelis started. And that was an interdisciplinary kind of group of economists, computer scientists, statisticians, anthropologists. They were sort of embedded in a tech company that with a kind of mandate to improve the efficiency of the marketplace. And so a lot of the work I did there was about bad buyer experiences. So imagine you buy something on eBay and it shows up and it's scratched or broken or doesn't show up at all. What happens to you as a customer? And that's not something that you could test because you can't like whack half the packages at random with a baseball bat as they leave your warehouse. But you need to know that, right, in order to like police your marketplace.
Would you basically look at some observational kind of causal inference methods where you happen to have those defects, and then you would assume some sort of identification and look at long-term outcomes, or what would you look at?
Yeah, so we tried to basically like imagine the regression where the outcome is how much revenue you like how much money you've spent on eBay, right, in a year, and the kind of the X variable is whether you had one of these bad buyer experiences or not. And even if you throw like pretty sophisticated like causal inference or machine learning techniques at that, you're always getting like a huge positive effect. I think that's purely a selection story because people that love eBay use it all the time. They tend to like go after things that are maybe too risky or they know how to work the claim system. So that kind of generates this selection. And so there, the panel data methods worked really well at recovering kind of the true causal effect, which was negative. And there was, but like the ML stuff, you always got like a large positive coefficient, even if you could kind of get it to a point where it was maybe not statistically significant.
So maybe that's a good example to explain to people how is causal inference and I guess traditional ML different. And of course they can complement each other, but like why would you care about causality?
I think I have somewhat extreme views on this topic, so let me say that. But I think that most business problems are fundamentally causal, and kind of traditional predictive ML approaches, like taking straight off the shelf, often don't give you the right answer. And so there's a nice example of this, a paper by Eva Escarza in the context of cell phone carrier and also like an interest organization, like subscription based. And then she's trying to basically handle customer churn when customers like leave your marketplace or your platform. And there, the traditional machine learning approach is right to say, okay, let's predict who's likely to leave our platform, and we'll intervene by, let's say, giving them some cash or some discount on their current plan in order to get them to stay. And what she found that kind of the people that have the high probability of leaving, as estimated by these models, are not the people, or they have much more limited overlap with the people for whom, if you were to intervene and give them some incentives to stay, they would respond to that. And the people that would leave if you don't give them that. And so there, like doing the straight up traditional ML thing doesn't get you the right answer from a kind of a customer lifetime value maximizing interventions. And you have to go back to the experiments, you have to do heterogeneous treatment effects, and then you use those experiments to target your costly intervention.
Right. And so basically to, I guess, restate it, if you just predict who's likely to leave, probably, in many cases, a large subset of those people are going to leave no matter what. So if you give them, say, a cash bonus, they're going to say, well, thank you for the cash bonus. Now I'm leaving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you see this stuff come up in like marketing questions, right? Where you have like pretty sophisticated media mix models. And when you sort of compare them to what you get out of a maybe more experimental approach, you get like very, very different and typically much, much smaller results. So I think those are kind of my, these like kind of two academic papers really resonate with like my own experience of kind of doing this thing in industry for 13 years at this point.
And so having worked in big companies and also with smaller companies, do you find that there is a awareness of this in smaller companies that don't have an economist, or do they not even know that this is a thing they should be thinking about?
I really think that most companies, especially early on, can't really tell the difference between an economist, a data scientist, a statistician, a machine learning person. They kind of view them all as sort of substitutable. And there's very few companies, especially early on, that have kind of an economist like job family or in a separate kind of track.
And so what led you to going from working at a big company like eBay to now having this fractional title where you work with many companies?
I think so. I started out kind of, at Domino's, which is this long company, then eBay, which was, started in 1996, and then Thumbtack, which is a local services startup, was my third career. And I got really excited about like kind of working back all the way to this kind of, the big back moment where there's like an idea and that idea starts becoming real and kind of wanting to participate in that early on. And so my career has been kind of working all the way back. Unfortunately, like even when the job market is good, the pre-seed startup generally doesn't want an economist. So kind of having to fractionalize myself has been kind of the way to kind of make this dream come true.
Do you typically work with small companies that need an economist and understand the value of an economist, but don't really have a place for an economist full time? Or do you also work with many companies that don't know what an economist is, but then you introduce them to the idea and end up working with them?
I think it's a mixture of both. So a fantastic way to, to kind of target people is to go after companies that are being started by founders who have spent time at companies that had economists. So like a lot of Uber folks are now starting companies and they kind of know exactly what an economist is useful for. So that makes it easy. But a lot of cases, you just start working with somebody and you sort of have a series of meetings where you try to kind of, get traction on a problem, something that they're grappling with. And then they start to see the value of kind of this approach. And there it's a lot more about educating them about what this weird fractional economist can really do to their marketplace.
Right. And the tricky thing with causal inference is that we don't have a accuracy metric the same way we have with, say, prediction, right? Where we can say, well, I made this model, this is the out of sample performance, and then we can run it and hopefully it also performs well. And do you have, I guess, any tricks or any thoughts on how do you explain to someone that they should trust this causal estimate, especially when you can't use technical jargon?
That's a good one. That's a good question. I think one is, what are you comparing this causal estimate to? One approach is that a lot of startups, they'll often just imitate something that someone else in their field is doing, or they just kind of just make a guess, right? And so sometimes something like a causal estimate that combines a little bit of economic theory that kind of tell a story about a particular behavior and some more analysis is kind of better than that like naive mimicry. Because a lot of startup founders, they'll have expertise in like whatever they're doing, but like things like pricing, network effects, like that's a little bit of a much more of unknown quantity to them.
Yeah. Well, and I guess so one thing, if we think about, say, the eBay example you mentioned, where we have a hypothesis that getting damaged packages has a negative effect on consumer spending, we kind of have an intuition about what the magnitude is going to be, right? But then depending on exactly how you structure your panel model and what samples you take, you're going to have a different magnitude of your estimate. So how do you approach something like this?
I think one, it's not obvious. Maybe this is kind of the assumption of the question. It's not obvious that the effects would be harmful because one version is, you go to eBay for the first time, you have maybe not a great experience, and maybe you just say, okay, this was a bad seller, but I'm still gonna, try again on eBay. Just like if you go on a bad date, you don't like give up dating. But that's not often the truth, right? Because like a bad customer experience would just cause people to just abandon the platform entirely. And so it is negative, but like maybe some people thought this wasn't going to be the case because they would stay and just pick a new seller. The other is that you try to run like experiments, maybe that are a little bit longer and to detect some of these things. And so that's kind of another way to say, okay, my non-experimental estimate is in the ballpark of what we think is the truth. The other is, to present like some range of estimates and try to say, okay, maybe if we don't know exactly where we are, like what would this effect have to be to make the policy of removing sellers that are generating these bad experiences off the platform and the revenue and kind of the cost of reduced revenue from doing that to be worth it. And you sort of try to make maybe more assumptions. You say, well, at least the effect I think is at least this big. If that's the case, then this is, worth kind of having a more stringent policy.
And so I feel like that touches on 2 points that, for example, when I teach at USC, I often repeat to students. One is like, you're never going to know what the quote unquote right model is. So do some different models to get a range of estimates. And then the second thing is always tied to a dollar amount, because only then are you going to know what to do about it, really. Also, I guess business people tend to care about dollar amounts. If you tell them that the p-value is something, well, I mean, a lot of them care about the p-values too, but it's kind of less meaningful than a revenue stream.
Yeah, especially like a confidence, sub-confidence intervals. I think that's exactly right.
So have you worked with marketing or marketing effectiveness measurements?
Yeah, about half of my time at Thumbtack was spent on doing marketing measurement for paid search, for television, OTT, which is like ad-supported internet television, like where you, instead of a membership fee, you pay by watching ads, podcasts, some even like direct mail or billboard, those kinds of questions. And I think there, the experimental approach was also like very, very effective. And in the long run has like shifted Thumbtack to a company that does experiments that are ongoing, periodic, to sort of update the attribution scheme that they use.
Because from what I understand, it's really challenging to just run a media mix model where you have all of these advertising streams, right? Because there's so many selection and interaction effects.
I mean, one very helpful technique I found to kind of kick the tires on the media mix models that the vendors are, bringing to you every day is to take an experiment where you did, do something and then get them to apply the media mix model to the treatment group and say like, well, imagine if we actually did the treatment in the experiment, like what would happen?
If they get the right estimate, or well, if they get the completely wrong estimate, then you have proof that what they're doing is not correct. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So same thing you can do. You can just you can do if you're working with like an agency that's getting some percentage of what you're spending on marketing to put in their pocket. You can do like the same thing. Just you sort of like pretend. Let's take the start of the campaign, pretend it started a month earlier than it actually did, and run their measurement methodology on this sort of phantom campaign. And oftentimes you'll get like an estimate that's like half the size of their so you kind of know right away like to kind of you need to haircut kind of the numbers that they're bringing to you.
Right. And so that's something simple a company can do even if they don't have an economist on board and they just want to test.
Or an experiment, right? you just need to be in a position where you have some period with advertising and some period off, and
right. But then you still have to think about, are the time periods before and after comparable and so on, right? Like it's not that easy to run an experiment to measure ad effectiveness.
I think in this case, that the effect should be precisely zero. So all you're importing is kind of the pattern when the ad showed up in the month after. Yeah, but I agree, ad experiments, especially with television, are really, really tricky to run. And even with things like OTT, where you still have this, you could randomize at like an IP level. So maybe, exactly a particular household is in and out of the treatment. But, a lot of people are watching OTT like while they're on the bus, or sometimes you even see it while they're driving. And there you really you have a kind of a measurement issue that a lot of people could be exposed to both treatment and control.
So what are the biggest types of questions that early startups kind of struggle with, or where they would need an economist expertise? I'm assuming marketing being one of them.
Marketing, that's surprisingly less of one, because a lot of, if you're a brand new startup, no one knows about you, marketing is going to be pretty incremental. So they're a little bit less worried about that. One is, I think, is like revenue, because a lot of times the companies come to me and they have product market fit, they have some users, and they're trying to figure out like, well, who should we charge, how much, what should those payments look like? Should be a membership fee, should be a percentage. And so helping them think through what the network effects of their business are and how that sort of translates into how much you should charge. So helping them figure out, okay, this is the subsidy side of my marketplace. Maybe the consumers are the ones that have really strong network effects that bring in the supplier, or, and then you should kind of leave them alone, subsidize them, and then you should monetize on the other side of the marketplace. Try to figure out who's going to be more price sensitive given what availability is of kind of competitors or complementary services and things like that. That's probably the biggest chunk of what I do. is that initial kind of monetization revenue step.
And so is that based more on applying some kind of economic theory to the problem, or do you also run a lot of experiments?
I think in this case, it's completely like pre-data. And so there you're just saying, like, for example, which side of your marketplace has more competitors, right? Because that's something, and you sort of trying to just, bound maybe these network effects. So it's a lot of it is combination of intuition and just sort of thinking through like the institutional business setting where your kind of partner at the startup really knows that area really well. And when we come together, we can sort of quantify that a lot better.
Do you have like a hypothetical example just to make this a little bit more tangible?
Yeah, so think like, so kind of hypothetical example, we were talking earlier about like people going back to the office. So think about a company that matches startups that need office space with available office space. And so here we're going to think like who should be the money side and who should be the subsidy side. And so one is like, it's pretty easy to find like landlords, right? There's a directory of landlords, there's a directory of brokers that handle commercial real estate for offices, but it's very hard. There is no directory of startups that need office space, right? It's very hard to find those people. And they probably, if you aggregated that demand, you could really get a lot of landlords and brokers onto your platform. So here, like that suggests that maybe like the landlords are going to be, or the brokers are going to be the money side of your marketplace. And the startups are going to be kind of the subsidized, kind of, low cost, helping them get onboarded part of the marketplace. And so thinking through like things like that, I think can be very helpful. And after like that initial decision on where do we monetize, you could start getting into the how and doing some calculations about, well, like how much value are these transactions generating? And what does that imply about like how much we should charge? What are your various competitors charging? Are those competitors for both sides of the marketplace or just one? And so that kind of can help you refine and get to an actual like number, or at least a range of prices or fees that you can do.
And so this is particularly applicable if you have a two-sided marketplace, basically, right? Like your whatever rideshare or Airbnb or something like that. If you're a company that's selling chocolate through their website and advertising it on Instagram, you don't really have this consideration.
I mean, you still have to decide how to price. And I think there, economists that do demand estimation can be useful. A lot of times, like the companies have very simple heuristics, about, cost plus some percentage markup, and then they just go with that. I think economics can help you get a little bit beyond that, certainly.
That's great. Well, thank you. I think it's a good example. And I like the way of thinking about it, of who's the money side in this two-sided marketplace, right? Like it's kind of obvious when you think about it, but I don't think it is obvious to think about it this way.
Yeah. So here, like it's, I guess a lot of the work I do is like just developing like a set of questions, and that sort of like spits out like an answer, or maybe, something that's a little bit more, or at least a trade-off maybe of monetizing in a particular way.
So suppose you're an early startup founder and you listen to this podcast and you're like, well, maybe I need an economist. Of course, you can reach out to Dimitriy, would be one place to start. But my general question is, like, where do people go to find this sort of expertise? Is there a lot of people out there? Like, if someone wanted to, is it easy to find? Is there consulting companies?
I don't know of any. I'm aware of the only competitors that are sort of professional economists that maybe, work in academia or have spent some time at tech companies and have kind of hung up their own shingle. I think the main competitors are people that have started successful startups before, and now they kind of spend their time coaching other early stage marketplaces to overcome some of the same hurdles that they've seen before in their career. So they tend to be like product managers, analytics people, even some kind of folks that do software engineering in a previous life.
I guess another way of asking my question would be is, as economists working in tech, it's a really small world. So we kind of all know each other and we're all very aware of the types of problems we work with and the solutions that exist. And so I'm curious, the general public, startup conferences, places like that, is that something that's talked about? Or do you feel like there's too little awareness in the startup world about causal inference?
I think there's too little awareness. And there's also, I think, this belief that you really don't need all that experimentation, causal inference stuff until you're fairly far along in the process. I think that that view is mistaken. I also think that like the whole fractional, whatever, CFO, CMO, that's being kind of enabled by sort of better technology that allows you to sort of match clients. And so I think people understand that use case. Like if you don't have revenue, you really don't need a CFO, or at least you need one like for an afternoon, to help with maybe some fundraising stuff. And so that kind of awareness, I think, is finally starting to, that you could hire like a fractional data person. I think that's becoming, maybe more legible to startup founders.
And I guess so switching gears a little bit to the other side, for you as an entrepreneur, how has the journey been going from working at a big company to finding and working with smaller clients?
I think it's often like the things that surprise me maybe is a good way to sort of think about this. So I think like getting paid is definitely one of these things that like I've never in my life had to chase people to like pay an invoice and kind of trying to bargain down hours after the fact. Like that's kind of a completely new to me. I think solopreneurship is also like a little bit lonely. Like you're kind of generally working for yourself, and even though you have kind of partners within the start company, you're only there like 1 or 2 days a week, and you're constantly on Slack or emailing. But like building those connections is a little bit tougher than I guess than what I imagined. And it's also like way more chaotic than I imagined from my experience at kind of mid-stage startup life. It's just priorities are shifting, it's chaos, and sometimes it's kind of the outsider. It's hard to know exactly what's happening and be like responsive to that, something you're working on. And the other thing is like it's really dependent on the funding environment. So right now I think there's kind of a drought in VC funding, especially for kind of non-AI startups. And the money that people got a few years ago is starting to run out. And so there's kind of for someone like me, there's kind of real dependence on that VC cycle.
I guess, are there any things that surprised you about this whole endeavor, except for the chasing down unpaid invoices?
I think one thing is the amount of spam that you get when you start doing this. Like every day, there's sort of like labor law posters, like lead gen, people that are trying to sell you software tools or financial products. That's been like, quintupled the amount of spam that I get in my life. There's also like, I kind of thought this would be a good way for me to focus on like doing the things I really love, which is like coding, solving hard problems, like talking to people. But there is so much other stuff that you have to do, like crafting your pitch. Like there's tax stuff, there's business development, like going to parties and having drinks with people and posting like thought leadership nonsense on LinkedIn. And that stuff seems to be very impactful, but it really eats into a lot of your time. And so kind of I think like the code switching is hard because you have to like wear many hats and be able to jump back and forth. I think that's much more difficult than I imagined.
I talked to someone else who's an entrepreneur in the econ space as well, and he said that it's sales, sales, and sales, which leads me to my next question. How do you find early startup founders? Is it meetups with drinks? Is it through LinkedIn? And what's the best way of doing this?
It is, yeah, the kind of the community, various communities. So they're both offline and online is a good. Going to a lot of like events. Lenny, for example, does like these meetups all over the world where you can go and kind of meet people that are starting companies. That's a great one. Some of it is just starting to be like word of mouth. Kind of the first cohort of startup founders that I'm working with are referring you. The other is to make contacts with VCs, and then sometimes they will help you locate clients that kind of benefit from your help.
For other people who may be listening and interested in doing something similar, do you find it's a big advantage to be in the Bay Area or some other area that has entrepreneurial activity?
I think a lot of this stuff like can take place online. So there are various like Slack channels, for example, that you can join. For the in-person stuff, yeah, the Bay Area has a higher density of it as does New York or Seattle and even LA to some extent. But I think a lot of the work, the companies I do with, like I've visited one company in person just to see what it was like, but most of the work is, remote.
And so you have been doing this for a while now. Has it shifted more to remote after the pandemic? I mean, I guess it obviously has, but has it been a very strong shift in your experience?
I mean, I think a lot of startups are don't have offices, but they often will like work together out of like a founder's house. I suspect that with the larger companies, you're going to see much more of a return to office culture. And I hear kind of from my colleagues throughout that like there's often pressure to have more and more days in the office and eventually maybe transition to something like 4 or 5. With startups, I still be a time when office stuff is less important. But even early on, you see like startups having offices working like a WeWork or like something like a Cody office, which is kind of pioneered this multi-tenancy system where one startup gets, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the other startup is there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And those kind of, water cooler conversations, interactions, I think are like very, very productive.
I agree. I mean, I'm personally a huge fan of remote work, but I also think meeting people sometimes, right? And depending on what you do, and especially if it's an early startup, it probably makes sense. I know many of my listeners are either students or more junior data scientists and economists. Do you have any thoughts on what's the best way of getting into this? I'm sure you have interviewed many people, and today's job market is tough, I think. And it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg problem, right? If you don't have experience or you have little experience, then you want more experience, but then you need a job and then you're back to square one.
I think the best way to get your foot in the door is to try to do an internship. And typically that will happen this summer before your final year of your whatever undergrad, master's, or a PhD program. And that is the best way, especially like if you get an offer and you like the company, that's the best way to get a job. But also having an offer from a company and then sort of shopping that around can often be a very good signal to other companies that you're somebody that they should consider. If you don't have that, then I think kind of targeting larger companies that have university programs for new grads is a good strategy. And that's a great way to get some experience under your belt working in tech. They'll invest a lot in teaching you things like more formally. And then if you want to go to a startup down the road, you'll have a little bit of financial security and also experience that will make you attractive to those companies. That's probably my best kind of advice for that. The other is that you could start doing is to start doing this consulting stuff part-time, like through some sort of platform like Upwork, and there are a few others where you could maybe get a little bit of experience of working with a tech company under your belt. It's going to be maybe things that are a little bit further removed from the traditional kind of applied economics that a lot of people do in tech. It might be more dashboards, things like that, but it's a good way to get some more working experience.
And so thinking about interviewing people, if you interview someone, what are the things that are sort of red flags versus green flags? Like this, I really like this candidate. Beyond, I guess, having the basic technical prerequisites.
I think being able to talk about like complicated technical things in a way that's accessible to someone who's like a software engineer or PM or a business person, that's something that's like very, very useful. Communication skills are also up there. That's something that like most graduate schools programs don't teach at all, or colleges. And so being able to kind of communicate clearly, to kind of lead, to wrangle all the cats that you need to do, and sort of signals of that. And those might be like some sort of outside activity. It might be like somebody that convinced a company to hand over data for them to use in their presentation. Like those are very good, strong signals. The other is like, I try to look at people's code. I say, okay, you've just presented, your job market paper, like show me the part of your code that, produced table 5, and open up, you look and you see, is the code well organized? Are there comments? Like, can they say like, oh, this is what does this? Or do they like stare at it and scratch their head for a while? So that's something that I also do. Finally, just sort of being able to think on your feet is another example. So I kind of try to put up maybe a slightly simplified version of something like a problem that I worked on in that company. And then the two of us will sort of simulate like a working on it together with a whiteboard and doing all that. And I'm a big fan of homeworks versus over like a live coding, just because I feel like that sends a stronger signal, even at a risk that, they might get some assistance from somebody on the homework assignment. So something where like I give you a data set, some questions, and you have, a weekend to turn something around and to produce. I prefer memos because I think it's important for people to write well and clearly, but sometimes like a deck answering those questions.
That's an interesting perspective, and I agree with you. I think I would prefer to get a homework back, right? Because it's a better signal, and then you just have to assess what's the probability that someone else wrote this. But I think if you ask them to talk about it, it's probably pretty clear whether the thought process was their own or not.
Yeah, yeah. They're really egregious where someone just like dumped it all into like Chat GPT. I think you can usually spot that a mile off.
And so have you seen generative AI impact your workspace notably in the last months or not really?
For sure, like one of the things I worked on recently is John Horton at MIT has a startup that allows you to simulate AI agents as sort of an alternative to maybe going out or doing surveys of people. And so working with a marketplace that's sort of targeted at a group of, let's tall women, hypothetically, just an example, right? Very hard to survey because a lot of like traditional survey products, they will allow you to target on age and gender and location, but you can't target by height. And so the way you typically do it is like you have a question, how tall are you? And then you discard 99% of your data. And so using John's tools that he's open sourced, we were able to basically run a survey of tall women, get them to answer questions, and got results that sort of matched the kind of the summary statistics that you get out of a lot of industry surveys, and they seem to be returning like sensible answers that match the way like real women would respond. And so this was a huge savings to this company.
And so how does that work? So basically it's AI generated answers on a model that's trained to answer like tall women in this example.
No, you just sort of say you're a tall woman in the US, you're in this age group. Like what are the things that you find challenging about like buying clothing? Or you could even kind of engineer the prompt based on like a past customer history. And so you say, okay, like these are the things you bought before, here's the image data for those items. So maybe you're sort of learning something about like preferences from kind of understanding that data.
So I'm assuming if this is open source, there's a link we could include in the podcast notes.
Yeah, goemeritus.com. I think we can throw in all the links to like things that we've talked about throughout.
Yeah. I hadn't heard about this. And I'm always looking for examples of where generative AI can be used by economists, right? Because it's not so clear cut. I've spoken to many people who say that, well, they don't really see a future very soon where you could be like, hey, this is my data. What's the causal impact of something, right? Because you really have to think through the identification assumptions and all of that.
Yep. I still like kind of playing around that where I sort of know what the outline of a right answer looks like. I think those tools are still pretty weak, even more some of the specialized custom GPTs you can now get from kind of third-party developers.
And so for people kind of midway in their career, do you have any thoughts on the IC track versus the manager track? And maybe the answer is different depending on what you want to do. Like suppose you want to go into consulting or something like that, or start your own company.
I'm definitely, my strength is an IC. That's what I love doing. I've kind of managed people and done like recruiting and all the other components of that in my career. My advice would be don't try to do both at the same time. Like if you're going to do the manager stuff, like just realize that it's going to be very difficult for you to pick up those skills. And it's hard to switch from kind of manager mode to IC mode effectively. So I'd say, allow for that and kind of realize that your IC stuff is going to like become a minority of your kind of mind share. The other is like to try, like get your company to give you an intern for the summer and see if this is the sort of stuff that you really like. So maybe kind of a lighter way to encourage those skills. I think that if you definitely want to, if you're on like the VP of something track, I think the manager experience is much more important and will put you on that trajectory. Being kind of a super senior IC, like what people call fellow at like the bigger tech companies, like that's not going to get you to VP. It's going to get you a place where you're very well compensated, you work on interesting things, and you don't have to do performance reviews and spend most of your life in meetings. And so I think that route is still satisfactory. It's a little bit undefined, right? Because like we're approaching, the kind of the first cohort of economists that went into tech is probably, 10 to 15 years old, and we're kind of starting to see. So a lot of times we're writing like the criteria for what that senior IC economist track looks like kind of as we go and as we mature. And so it's been really interesting.
If someone aspires to do what you do and is not strongly inclined either way, do you think the manager or the senior IC experience is more valuable as a preparation?
I think everyone kind of starts out in the IC and then sort of pivots to one or the other. But I would say managers are definitely in higher demand, and you will get a lot of pressure to go from IC to manager in a long career, and less kind of in the other direction, unless you're terrible at managing, which is a common outcome in our profession. So I'd say, yeah, I mean, respond to that. And I think there's kind of financial accompaniments to that extra demand for managers.
Dimitriy, this is super interesting. I don't know, is there any other insights you would like to add about the importance of causal inference and why everyone needs an economist as a closing thought?
The thing I see, like a lot of business people complain that the data scientists in their company lack domain knowledge and kind of business intuition. But economists are like the tribe that scores like very high on those dimensions. And so I would say, like, if this is the problem, like here's the solution. The other thing that I found useful in my career is that you need like a C-suite champion to sort of advocate for this approach. And typically that person is going to be in finance, or maybe is like a senior engineering person. Those are kind of often where those champion, or maybe some of the more sciencey part of the company. And you kind of need those people to back you up. So developing relationships with them and getting them to advocate for you is something that I think is very important. The other thing is, like, I know for a long time I thought that like just getting your foot in the door and keeping your head down and sort of building credibility with your stakeholders through doing like good work with experimentally validated results was sort of sufficient. And so telling them, I want to get it right with you by kind of giving you methods that reliably deliver the truth and kind of bask in the warm glow of your success, I don't think that works very well. And there is a kind of like what I call it, like a Gresham's law of analytics, which is that sort of flawed analyses are going to drive out the good, and resources are going to get reallocated from kind of areas where there's more scrutiny of the numbers to areas where there's less, and people maybe are less skilled or maybe less scrupulous. And so that often makes it really hard to do good economics in industry. And then you have to really think about setting up processes about how evidence gets used and having standards, and maybe, being more of a jerk in meetings when somebody is doing something that's not quite up to snuff, and really not keeping your head down as much as I thought. So, economists often get this advice, right? Be nicer than like the seminar culture that you grew up in. I think that's important, but I think it's not, you should sort of pivot a little bit on that advice.
Right. And you have to speak up for yourself, right? Because no one else is going to do it for you, unless you have a very strong advocate in the C-suite or somewhere, right? But there's definitely is a politics aspect to it.
And the other thing I'm really excited to see is that there's a first wave of economists that are starting their own companies. So like Mike Ostrovsky at Topsort, Duncan Gilchrist at Delphina, Joe Golden is on his Perfect Rec. This is a second startup. So I feel like those places might be a really great place to go as an economist, because you already have that champion in the C-suite. And I'm excited to see people that kind of, grow up and working in those companies and helping them flourish. I think that's going to really unlock, I think, a lot of career opportunities for people that are just sort of coming up when those companies do succeed.
That is definitely super exciting. I'll see if I could get someone else to maybe speak about that, because I think it would be interesting to hear how the economist perspective marries with the early startup perspective. Because we're a little bit spoiled in big tech companies, right? Like we're so acknowledged as economists already, so it's easy in a sense.
You're a known quantity, yeah. That's exactly right.
Well, Dimitriy, this was great. Thank you. I learn every time I talk to people. I hope the listeners do as well. And we'll link everything we talked about, as well as your contact info, for anyone who needs an economist expert on their board or somewhere.
I appreciate that. Thank you.